She was marked by society as unmarriageable, but he saw her as a weapon. In a world of cold alliances, the magnetic pull between Julia and the formidable Duke of Ravenswood defied every rule. This is a tale of secrets, danger, and a forbidden love sealed with a kiss on Christmas Eve. Prepare yourself for the Duke's most intense surrender. Before we dive into this drama of high society and forbidden passion, if you love stories where danger meets desire, hit that like and subscribe to the channel. We want to know where you are experiencing this story. Comment your city's name below. The air in the receiving line at the Duchess of Waverley's winter ball hung heavy with the cloying sweetness of forced civility and the fading perfume of too many wilting roses. A symphony of rustling silks, hushed whispers, and the distant lilting strains of a valse lente from the grand saloon provided the backdrop to Julia's slow, agonizing surrender to another predictable evening. She stood exactly where she had stood for 2 consecutive seasons, a half-step too far back, a whisper too quiet, entirely ornamental amidst the vibrant tapestry of London's elite. The polite, superficial smiles of dowagers and debutantes alike slid past her, landing instead on her younger sister, Clara, who possessed the lively spirit and undeniable beauty that Julia, at 23, was now painfully aware she lacked. She wore a gown of pale blue silk, a shade delicate as a winter sky, designed for a debutante's first bloom. On Julia, however, it felt like a deliberate contradiction. It spoke of an innocence and a fragility she had once possessed, but which had long since been eroded by the relentless tides of expectation and disappointment. The rigid boning of her stays pressed against her ribs, a physical echo of the invisible corset of societal judgment that constricted her breath. She was a woman entering her 3rd season, a distinct and damning mark of the unmarriageable. She could feel the whispers before their words reached her ears. They were like the insidious scratch of silk against a rough stone, constant, abrasive, chipping away at the edges of her resolve. The estate is entailed, you know. No dowry to speak of. Too sharp of mind, too quiet of tongue. Each unspoken syllable, each dismissive glance pressed down on her chest, threatening to compromise the rigid, perfectly composed posture she maintained. Her spine, a slender line of defiance, refused to bend. She repeated the litany to herself, a desperate internal mantra. I am content. I require nothing from this society. My books are sufficient, my solitude a comfort. But the subtle tremor in her left hand, clutching her white satin gloves with excessive force, betrayed the feverish, frantic truth. She was not content. She longed for something indefinable, something beyond the cold arithmetic of advantageous matches. A sudden, familiar tightening seized the muscles behind her eyes. It was not the stinging burn of sorrow, but a cold, pure anger, sharp as a winter's blade, at the sheer injustice of the calculations that governed a woman's worth in this gilded cage. She hated the quiet desperation she was expected to feel, the shame she was supposed to embody. And in the darkest, most secret corner of her heart, she hated the undeniable fact that her spirit, against all evidence, against all reason, was still capable of harboring a small, foolish flicker of hope. She did not glance at her reflection in the gilded mirrors that lined the ballroom, but she felt the telltale rush of heat up her neck, a blush of mortification that she ruthlessly fought back with a deep, silent inhalation. Her only weapon was her unwavering composure. The ormolu clock on the mantelpiece chimed 10. 10 dry, resonant strikes that cut through the genteel din of the ballroom like a sudden, unexpected silence. The shift in the room was instantaneous, palpable. The music seemed to mute itself. The frivolous chatter died down to an anticipatory hush, a collective intake of breath. It was the moment of arrival, not of a king, but of a power far greater than the crown in their small, insular world. Simon, the Duke of Ravenswood, arrived precisely on the hour, a man who moved with the weight of an ancient lineage and a formidable fortune. He did not possess the languid, easy grace of the other gentlemen, who prided themselves on their effortless charm and studied nonchalance. His presence was not charm, it was a physical weight, an almost imperceptible alteration of the very air pressure in the room. He moved with the controlled, contained lethality of a predator who knows he has no rivals. His dark blue tailcoat tailored to perfection, the impeccably tied cravat doing little to soften the sharp, commanding lines of his countenance. His strides were long, purposeful, each step an assertion of dominion. Julia, acutely aware of the stir his arrival created, tried to make herself smaller. She pressed her spine against the cool silk damask wall, willing the delicate pale blue of her dress to blend into the shadows cast by an enormous potted palm. "He will not see me," she pleaded internally. "He never does. I am too insignificant, too forgettable, for a man who moves planets with a single inclination of his head." But he stopped, not 2 paces from her. He was conversing with the Duchess of Waverley, a low, smooth baritone that was almost swallowed by the ambient noise, yet which seemed to vibrate, impossibly, in her own inner ear. Julia found herself utterly paralyzed, trapped in the exquisite torture of his proximity. Every nerve ending in her body seemed to hum with an unbidden awareness. She noticed the small things, details that should have been invisible from her vantage point. The tiny, almost imperceptible scar just above his left eyebrow, a faint line against tanned skin. The way his cufflink, a piece of deep, polished onyx, caught the crystal candlelight, reflecting a fleeting spark of cold fire. And then the smell of him, a stark, clean blend of French-milled soap, expensive leather, and a hint of brisk winter air, carried in on the fine wool of his coat. It was a scent that spoke of danger and vast, unapproachable distances. She told herself sternly to look away. Look at the tapestry. Count the stitches in the embroidery. Think of the laundry list, the accounts, anything but him. But her gaze, as if governed by a magnetic pull she could not resist, lifted. It was an involuntary act, a silent rebellion against her own carefully constructed defenses. His head turned, slowly, deliberately. Their eyes met. There was no warmth in his gaze, no familiar flicker of polite society recognition. His eyes, the color of deep amber, almost golden in the candlelight, were direct, assessing, and utterly consuming. They held her for an unnaturally long moment, a blatant violation of the unspoken protocols that governed their interactions. It was an interrogation without words, a stripping away of all pretense. In that prolonged silence, which was only silent to them, her mind exploded with chaotic, panicked thoughts. Does he know? Does he know the truth of my family's dwindling fortune? Does he know the lies they told, the desperate machinations? Does he see the pathetic truth of my unmarriageable status? Her throat constricted, dry and tight, as if she had swallowed dust. The sheer intensity of his look was not a flirtation. It was a challenge, a slow, deliberate unraveling of all her protective layers. He seemed to see past the pale blue silk, past the polite, practiced smile she had perfected, and straight to the tight, defiant knot of fear and pride twisting in her stomach. It was reckless. It was wrong. He should not be looking at me like this. He should not see so much. And yet she could not look down. Her proud spirit, though often crushed and silenced by society's decree, rose in that moment like a small, defiant flame. She met his gaze, unflinching, even as a tremor ran through her. He broke the intense connection first. The shadow of a smile, a mere twitch of muscle, touched his firm lips, a smile that did not quite reach his serious, searching eyes. It was more an acknowledgement of her unexpected resilience than an expression of amusement. Then he did something entirely unexpected. He took a single, deliberate step toward her, closing the impossible distance between them. Her breath caught, thin and shallow in her lungs. Miss Julia. The sound of her name spoken in that low, arresting voice was a jolt, a physical shockwave. It felt less like a conventional greeting and more like a profound, undeniable announcement. He raised a hand not to touch her, but to indicate the small, precise space directly beside her, against the cool marble wall, a space that was clearly meant for her. Your position here is detrimental to your visibility. It was not an insult. It was an observation, a precise and tactical assessment of an error. He was not criticizing her social failure. He was pointing out her poor defense strategy, her self-imposed obscurity. Your Grace. Her voice was a dry, thin reed of sound, barely a whisper, yet imbued with a fierce, unexpected spark. Some of us prefer the shadow. It holds fewer expectations. His amber eyes narrowed, the expression hardening into something akin to disapproval, or perhaps a curious kind of concern, a flash of something she could not decipher. I find that regrettable, Miss Julia. Shadows are places for secrets, yes, but they are also places where conviction withers, and I sense in you a conviction that deserves the light. He said nothing more. He merely waited. The Duke of Ravenswood, the most sought-after, the most formidable man in the country, was waiting for her to move. The pressure was immense. It was not a crude physical demand, but an undeniable exertion of pure, unyielding will. She felt her feet obey him before her mind did, a small, necessary step forward, out of the deepest shadow, into the periphery of the main light. The surrender was involuntary, instinctive. "Will you be attending the Fitzwilliam assembly?" "I believe so, Your Grace." Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic trapped bird. "Excellent." He gave a slight dismissive nod that acknowledged the end of their brief, intense exchange. He turned then, drawn by the polite, insistent hand of the Duchess toward the heart of the saloons, toward the true centers of power and influence. The room immediately returned to its fever pitch of noise and movement, a sudden cacophony after their private silence. But for Julia, the air remained thin and electrified. The small, almost unnecessary gesture of physical proximity, him standing so close that she could still feel the residual heat of his body on the cool marble, the lingering scent of his presence, had shattered her composure into 1,000 glittering fragments. Her legs trembled almost imperceptibly beneath the heavy silk. Why did he do that? What was the purpose? Was it pity, or a warning, or something else entirely, something I am too afraid to name? She touched the cool marble wall where he had stood. The small space where she had been forced to step forward felt less like a simple shift in location and more like a precipice. She knew with a certainty that made her heart pound with a strange mixture of dread and exhilaration that in that single intense exchange, the label of unmarriageable had ceased to be the most dangerous thing about her. Something else had begun, something far more consequential. The Fitzwilliam assembly was a smaller, more intimate affair than the Duchess's grand ball, which, in the perilous calculus of society, made it infinitely more dangerous. Less noise meant fewer places to hide. Julia navigated the room with the practiced, precise movements of a figure skater performing on thin ice. She was dressed in the deep emerald. The silk, rich and heavy, possessed a formidable sheen that caught the light, and the severe cut of the bodice gave her an air of cold, unapproachable sophistication. It was a disguise, a deliberate weapon, the color of a deep, coveted secret. She needed it tonight, because she felt utterly exposed, the memory of Simon's demanding gaze from the previous night, a persistent, burning heat on the back of her neck. She had told herself the exchange was meaningless, a duke's fleeting curiosity in a decorative plant, but the lie offered no comfort. Her palms were damp beneath the lace of her gloves, a betrayal she hid by constantly, needlessly, adjusting the small, insignificant ruffle at her wrist. She was standing near a group of young ladies, pretending to be engaged in a discussion about the recent fashions from Paris, when she felt the shift in the atmosphere. Not a sudden silence, but a subtle vacuum of attention, a gravitational pull of all gazes towards the entrance. Simon entered the saloon. Tonight he was without the dark gravity of his formal attire, wearing a midnight blue coat that drew the eye, but his presence was no less commanding. He was talking to Lord Ashworth, his head bent, yet his body language, the tension in his shoulders, the minimal movements, suggested a mind entirely elsewhere. Julia's breath hitched, a small trapped thing at the top of her throat. She did not breathe a sigh of relief or of disappointment when he first failed to see her. Instead, she felt the delicate silver pin at the back of her high neckline suddenly feel too tight, too constricting. Her strategy was simple: maintain distance. She kept her eyes fixed on the frivolous conversation, nodding precisely, allowing the drone of their voices to form a protective sound barrier. It failed instantly. Simon detached himself from his companion with the economy of motion she had already learned to fear. He cut directly across the floor, past a velvet-covered settee and a flustered baroness, moving with a directness that made every muscle in Julia's back clench. He stopped once again, a perfect arm's length from her. The group of girls around her suddenly remembered urgent engagements elsewhere, melting away with an embarrassing speed that left Julia completely isolated, an emerald island in a sea of retreating silks. Miss Julia. The sound of her name was less jarring tonight, but no less potent. It felt like a key turning in a lock she thought she had secured. She met his gaze, forcing the cool, serene expression that suited her gown. "Your Grace, I did not expect you to honor this particular small affair, and yet here I am." His tone was low, smooth, devoid of inflection, which made it 1,000 times more unsettling. His eyes, in the warmer lamplight of the assembly, seemed darker, the amber turning to a deep, smouldering bronze. He looked like a man who had come for a purpose, not for pleasure. "Are you enjoying the company?" The question was not a pleasantry. It was a probe. Julia could feel the pressure of his attention, seeking the vulnerability behind her sophisticated facade. "The conversation is diverting." She adjusted her fan, a wholly unnecessary nervous gesture. "The fan does not help." He sees the lie in my eyes. Simon did not smile. He leaned in marginally, a subtle, forbidden breach of their personal space that sent a shiver of awareness, sharp and clean, down her spine. The faint scent of leather and warm spice, a new note in his familiar dangerous scent, was suddenly overwhelming. "You are dressed like a challenge tonight, Miss Julia." The emerald does not whisper, it demands to be seen. He knew. He saw the armor she had donned. He saw the desperate conviction beneath the silk. "I hate that he can read me. I hate that I want him to." The thought was a searing admission, a reckless internal confession she instantly regretted. "It is merely a color, Your Grace." "Nothing is merely a color." His voice dropped lower, his gaze focusing entirely on her. "Colors are statements, and yours is a statement of hidden strength, a strength that is being wasted in these small, diverting conversations." His directness was breathtaking. It was a form of violence, a psychological battering ram against her defenses. She felt her meticulously constructed composure wobble. She hated him for forcing her to acknowledge the lie she was living. "I do not understand why my choice of attire is of any interest to the Duke of Ravenswood." "It interests me because you interest me." The declaration was delivered without passion, but with the cold, absolute certainty of a mathematical equation. It was a fact, an observation, not a compliment. Julia's throat went dry. She could feel the heartbeat quicken against the delicate bones of her chest, a frantic rhythm against the satin lining of her gown. She gripped the edge of the fireplace mantel, seeking the grounding cold of the marble beneath her fingertips. "That is a rather bold assertion, Your Grace." Her voice was barely a breath. "I do not trade in pleasantries, Miss Julia. I trade in facts. And the fact is, you stand apart. You listen with your eyes, not with your ears. And I find myself wondering what the unmarriageable Miss Julia is truly planning in the shadows." He was alluding to the whispers. He was acknowledging her supposed failure. But instead of feeling shame, a furious pride rose in her chest, a heat that was almost painful. "I am planning nothing, Your Grace. I am merely enduring." Enduring. He repeated the word, tasting it, judging it. His hand, large and finely shaped, rested on the mantel a scant inch from hers. The proximity was a deliberate violation, a boundary not crossed, but severely tested. "Enduring is for the weak, Miss Julia. You are not weak. You are merely waiting." "Waiting for what?" The question was torn from her, sharp and involuntary. He moved his head a fraction, bringing his face closer. Julia felt the sudden, alarming impulse to sway toward him, to simply collapse into the dark, solid promise of his presence. "Waiting for permission to be what you are. And I assure you, Miss Julia, I have never given a woman permission for anything." The statement hung in the air between them, a declaration of intent and a subtle, veiled warning. The silence that settled was thick and heavy, a profound pause in the flow of the ball, louder than the music, louder than the chatter. It was the sound of a choice being made. He straightened, pulling back that vital inch of space. He had done his damage. He had seen past the emerald armor, and now he was retreating, leaving her exposed to the emotional elements. "I trust you will find a more visible companion for the next dance." With that, he gave a curt, formal bow, his serious eyes never leaving hers until the last second. He turned and walked away, drawn now by the obligation of a host's daughter. Julia stood rooted to the spot, her hand still gripping the cold marble. She felt a residual heat where his hand had been. She repeated the words in her mind. Shadows are places for secrets, not for conviction. He hadn't offered her a dance. He had offered her a choice between remaining the unmarriageable Miss Julia, safely hidden in the shadows, or stepping forward, exposed, into the treacherous, dangerous light that he inhabited. And she knew with a sudden, devastating certainty that she was no longer capable of going back. The weeks that followed the Fitzwilliam assembly became a peculiar shared theatre for Julia and the Duke. Their encounters were brief, sharp, and always public, yet possessed a startling private intensity. He would find her in the periphery of a gathering, at the edge of a card game, by the dessert table, or within the shaded confines of a library, and simply exist there, forcing her out of her self-imposed exile. Julia continued to fight the strange, demanding pull of his presence. Today, she had chosen to wear the pale blue once more. It was a cold, bright afternoon at a country estate, and the soft, innocent hue felt like an olive branch she extended to the world, a silent plea for peace and invisibility. It failed utterly. The silk felt thinner than ever, offering no protection against the scrutiny she now felt from him. They were in the conservatory, a glass and iron structure that smelled richly of damp earth, citrus blossoms, and the cloying sweetness of jasmine. The light was harsh, unfiltered, leaving no space for secrets. Julia pretended to be absorbed by a particularly rare fern, tracing the delicate, frilled edges of its leaves. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of his immaculate leather boot scuffing momentarily on the stone floor. It was a small, dry sound that resonated in the vast, echoing silence of the glass room. He did not announce himself. He simply materialized a few feet behind her. She did not turn. Her back was suddenly a rod of unyielding tension, her neck too stiff to move. "You are examining the structure of the leaf, Miss Julia." His voice, low and close, seemed to filter through the glass walls and the jasmine scent, wrapping itself around her. A predictable pursuit for one who seeks to understand the underlying framework of all things. "I merely appreciate the perfection of the design, Your Grace." Her voice was steady, a victory she savored internally. "It is a refuge from the imperfect design of the main house. Imperfection is where change begins." He moved at last, coming into her peripheral vision. He leaned his shoulder against a fluted column, a study in relaxed vigilance. "I have observed that you prefer the refuge of logic to the mess of emotion. It is safer here. It is cleaner. He knows I am running. He is mocking my flight." The thought brought a cold rush of defensiveness. "And I have observed that you prefer the drama of confrontation, Your Grace." A subtle change softened the intensity in his bronze eyes, a flicker of something she dared to identify as amusement. It was quickly suppressed. "Confrontation, Miss Julia, is simply a means to an end. My end is clarity." He straightened suddenly, the small movement bringing his gaze down to her hand, which was still tracing the fern. "You are holding your breath." She inhaled sharply, a gasp of air that betrayed the lie of her calm. "It is warm in here." "No, it is fear." He corrected her, not cruelly, but with the cold, scientific precision of a doctor diagnosing a disease. "You fear that I will ask you something you cannot answer." Before she could form a rebuttal, a sudden, loud commotion erupted outside the glass doors. A group of rowdy young men, having clearly had too much claret, stumbled and fell, their laughter echoing violently. One of them, losing his balance entirely, pitched forward. His shoulder struck the lever that locked the double glass doors, and the loud metallic click of the bolt shooting home echoed like a gunshot. The rowdies recovered, laughed again, and continued their stumbling path toward the main garden, entirely oblivious. Julia and Simon were completely alone, locked in. The silence that followed was thicker, more profound than any they had shared before. It was not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of consequence. Julia felt a flicker of genuine panic. She was alone with the Duke of Ravenswood in a remote glass room, completely out of sight. Her reputation, already hanging by the thinnest of threads, would be irrevocably shredded if they were discovered. She moved instinctively toward the door. "We must be seen." Simon did not move. He watched her approach the glass, the frantic urgency in her movements. "The bolt is set, Miss Julia. They were thorough." His voice was calm, almost soothing, a counterpoint to the wild panic in her chest. She placed her gloved hand on the cold iron handle. It did not budge. The heat of the conservatory, once pleasant, suddenly felt oppressive, trapping the air and the dangerous closeness of his presence. She could feel the faint sweetness of the jasmine and the oppressive smell of the warm, damp earth, a primal, earthy scent that unnerved her. "This is a predicament, Your Grace, a catastrophic predicament. It is merely a circumstance." He pushed off the column and walked toward her. His movements were slow, deliberate, closing the distance not aggressively, but with an absolute, unquestionable confidence. He stopped directly behind her, not touching but so close that she could feel the faint heat radiating from his body through the thin silk of her dress. The proximity was immense, overwhelming, a pressure on her back that was almost unbearable. "You are trembling." "I am calculating the ruin of my reputation, Your Grace, which you, as a duke, would naturally find entertaining." "I find it inconvenient." His voice was low, and she felt the vibration of the sound against the back of her ear. "I do not enjoy watching people suffer consequences for a crime they did not commit." His hand rose. Not to touch her, but to reach past her, to the iron door handle. His fingers, long and strong, rested on the cold metal right beside her own. The small visual detail, her pale blue glove against his bare skin and the cold iron, was a sharp, physical intimacy. "We must appear unconcerned. We must appear to have been discussing something of great substance." "And what substance would justify a closed private room, Your Grace?" "Loyalty." He stated the word flatly, leaning closer still. His breath, warm and carrying the scent of mint and wine, brushed the delicate skin just behind her ear. "I have need of an ally, Miss Julia, one who values discretion over sentimentality, one who can see the underlying framework. It is a proposal, not of marriage but of danger. He is offering me a choice of protection, but the price is my soul, my secrets." Her heart hammered violently against the confines of her stays, a terrifying, beautiful rhythm. "You are proposing an alliance, Duke." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I am proposing a silent agreement. You are, by society's decree, alone. I am, by my own choice, alone. We have a mutual enemy in those who wish to see us fail. If we are to be discovered here, let it be understood that we were not merely flirting. We were forging a necessary bond." His eyes flickered down to her lips, a brief, sharp assessment of vulnerability, before returning to the intensity of her own gaze. He pulled his hand back from the lever, his fingers brushing the back of her glove, a sudden electric contact. "Let us begin the discussion of substance, Miss Julia. Time is now our adversary." Julia felt the last of her defenses crumble. The fear of ruin was replaced by the terrifying, exhilarating thrill of being seen, truly seen by him. "Very well, Your Grace." She turned to face him fully, her back no longer against the door, but now facing the heat of his presence. "Where do we begin the discussion of treason?" The forced seclusion in the conservatory lasted an excruciating 40 minutes, the longest, most concentrated period of Julia's life. It was a discussion of land politics, familial debts, and the precise cost of loyalty, all conducted under the pretense of intense private flirtation. By the time a footman, alerted by the absence of the Duke, finally forced the bolt, Julia's composure was a threadbare thing. She managed to exit the conservatory with her head held high, the pale blue silk a flag of defiance, but her hands were trembling violently, and her mind was a whirlwind of strategic numbers and the lingering warmth of Simon's breath near her ear. 2 days later, the tension was unbearable. Julia sought the only true solitude available to a woman of her rank, the desolate, winter-bare garden of her family's small townhouse, wrapped tightly in a thick wool cloak. The air was sharp, carrying the metallic scent of impending snow. She paced the frost-rimmed path, the rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath her velvet slippers a temporary anchor to reality. She was not thinking of the alliance. She was thinking of his hand near hers on the cold iron. "You are courting pneumonia, Miss Julia." The voice, low and familiar, caused her to halt mid-stride. Simon stood at the gate, having entered the grounds unannounced, a brazen breach of protocol. He wore a heavy riding cloak, its dark wool shedding a light dusting of fresh snow. She felt a dizzying surge of disbelief, followed by a terrifying, inexplicable sense of relief. "I find the cold air clarifying, Your Grace. It is difficult to think clearly amidst so much heat." The heat of the conservatory. He closed the gate behind him with a small, decisive clack. He did not approach her directly, but walked along the path parallel to her, matching her slow, measured pace. The sound of their 2 sets of footsteps on the gravel was the only sound in the otherwise silent garden. It felt like a duet. "I meant the heat of the season." She corrected him, her voice a little breathless. "No, you meant me." He turned his head to look at her, a direct, assessing gaze that stripped away her pretense. "That is the truth of our alliance, Julia. I bring the heat, and you, the clarity." He called me Julia, not Miss Julia. A small, intimate violation. It felt like a shared secret, a surrender. Her heart gave a sudden hard thump against her ribs. "Why are you here, Simon? You risk ruin by being alone with me like this. You have a reputation to maintain." "And you do not?" His question was not a jest. It was a cold, pure challenge. "Your reputation is already ruined by the calculation of London. My ruin would be for a greater purpose. I came to deliver this." He stopped, pulling a small, tightly rolled parchment from an inner pocket of his coat. He held it out to her. It was a dense map, clearly depicting a section of the northern border of his estate, with certain property lines faintly, but clearly, marked in red ink. "This map is critical to our current discussion. It is not for the eyes of the curious." She reached for it, her hand emerging from the voluminous sleeve of her cloak. Their fingers met. The contact was not a graze, but a brief, firm press of his skin against hers. His hand was warm, unexpectedly so, against the cold air and the chill of her skin. The moment stretched, the exchange of the paper, an excruciatingly prolonged act of intimacy. The shock of the warmth caused a tiny involuntary tremor to run up her arm. She did not snatch the map away. She held it, her fingertips resting against the firm, calloused skin of his palm. "Your hand is cold." He stated the fact simply, his thumb pressing down lightly, a micro-gesture of concern. "I have been out here too long. You are escaping." His voice was low, and he did not release the parchment. They stood there, connected by the small, fragile roll of paper, their eyes locked. "If I am escaping, Your Grace, it is from the pressure of your constant scrutiny. I am scrutinizing you because I have never met a woman who possessed such a powerful, silent pride. It is an unbearable weight. You need an equal to share the weight, Julia. You need a shield." He finally released the map, but the warmth of his touch lingered like a ghost on her skin. "A shield. He sees me as a burden, not a prize. But he is willing to carry the burden. He is willing to stand between me and the world." The realization flooded her with a fierce, terrifying tenderness. Julia opened the parchment, forcing her eyes onto the lines and the red ink. It was an impossible act, requiring a strength she did not possess. "The cost of this shield, Simon. What do you take in return?" He stepped closer, closing the distance once more, eliminating the space that society dictated. The scent of his coat, a blend of winter air and the fine wool, was an enveloping comfort in the cold. "I take your certainty, Julia. I take your ability to tell yourself that you are merely content." His gaze dropped to her mouth, an intense, searching look that was more intimate than any touch. "I take your belief that you are safe in the shadows." He did not touch her again. He simply stood there, an unyielding, powerful presence, offering her a choice that felt like a lifeline. He was the danger, and he was the only source of security. She felt the overwhelming need to simply lean into him, to feel the solid, undeniable reality of his body against the tremor of hers. To simply stop fighting. The sound of a door slamming in the main house, a crude, violent sound, shattered the intimacy. Simon straightened instantly, his expression returning to the formidable mask of the Duke. "Read the map, and do not come out into the cold without gloves again." He turned, the movement swift and silent, and walked quickly back toward the garden gate. The gate opened with a creak and closed with a definite clack. He was gone. Julia stood in the cold, holding the heavy map, her heart aching with a profound, terrifying tenderness. She had a secret, a weapon, and an alliance forged in proximity and vulnerability. But the most dangerous thing she possessed was the lingering warmth of his hand against hers. The silence felt heavy with the promise of a future she now desperately wanted. The silent agreement between Julia and Simon rapidly evolved into a shared, dangerous routine. They were two planets in a careful, high-speed orbit, meeting only at the edges of the universe. Their meetings were always about the maps, the debts, the political maneuvering required for the alliance, yet every word spoken felt like a veil over something far more volatile. It was the night of the Marquis of Harrington's masquerade. This was the largest, most anonymous event of the season, a chance for Julia to truly hide. She chose the Uva Bordeaux, a rich, dark velvet that seemed to absorb the light, paired with a simple black domino mask that covered only her eyes. The choice was deliberate. She wanted to be dangerous, unseen, and armed. She stood on the grand balcony, which overlooked the garden, the cool night air a welcome relief from the suffocating heat and perfume of the ballroom. The velvet cloak felt heavy, comforting, and yet inadequate. Below her, a complex knot of political rivals and gossips gathered. Suddenly she felt the presence. It wasn't a sound or a sight, but a sudden intense change in the air's polarity, a sharp scent of ozone and rain that she now inextricably associated with him. Simon materialized from the shadow of a stone archway. He wore a simple, unadorned black cloak and no mask, a deliberate display of unapologetic power. He did not need to hide. "You are dressed like a confession tonight, Julia." His voice was low, rough, edged with an intensity she had not heard before. "And you are dressed like an absolute ruler, Simon," she replied, her voice shaky despite her efforts at composure. "You do not fear discovery." "I fear nothing but wasted time." He walked toward the stone balustrade and looked down at the garden, his profile sharp and unforgiving against the faint moonlight. "I have secured the necessary documents. The land transfer is ready. The alliance is in place." "The deed is done," she summarized, the words tasting oddly flat. "The deed is done, deeds," he confirmed. "You are safe from the worst of your brother's debts. You are no longer merely unmarriageable. You are now allied to the Duke of Ravenswood." The silence that followed was immense, heavy with an unspoken weight. The political conversation was over. They were left with the terrifying, naked truth of their proximity. Julia's hands tightened on the marble balustrade. She felt the blood pulsing fiercely in the veins of her neck, a violent rhythm beneath the thin lace collar of her gown. The knowledge that she was safe was utterly eclipsed by the realization that her life now belonged to this man, in an emotional way that transcended any legal contract. "What now, Simon?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper in the vast space. "Do we simply return to our lives?" He turned from the balustrade, closing the final, terrifying gap between them. He stopped so close that the fine wool of his cloak brushed against the rich velvet of hers. It was a small physical intimacy that caused a sharp intake of breath. "Our lives are no longer separate, Julia. We have crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. You risked your reputation for my needs, and you risked your time for my salvation." He raised his hand. Not quickly, not aggressively, but with a terrible, slow deliberation that gave her every opportunity to pull away. She did not. The air felt too thick to move through. His fingers, warm and firm, reached for the black domino mask that covered her eyes. He did not touch the mask itself. Instead, his thumb rested on her temple, gently brushing the delicate skin there, a micro-touch that felt like the most profound intimacy. "You hide your eyes, Julia. You hide the conviction that I admire." His voice was a low, rough rumble. "I hide the truth, Simon. The truth of what I feel when you look at me." "And what is that truth?" She could not speak. The admission felt too monumental, too absolute. She felt the sudden, alarming impulse to simply lean her forehead against the unyielding strength of his chest and weep the shame and the fear away. He didn't wait for her answer. He had always been a man who dealt in certainties, not questions. He lowered his head, slowly, deliberately. He did not kiss her fiercely. He did not kiss her with passion. He kissed her with the finality of a decree. His lips, firm and warm, rested upon hers for the briefest, most chaste of moments. It was a kiss that was a rendition of the soul, a sealing of the unspoken, dangerous agreement. It was an acknowledgement of the shared future, a promise of absolute mutual protection. She felt not heat, but a profound, shocking grounding. The tremor that had plagued her hands all evening ceased instantly. She felt the firm pressure of his mouth, and the world seemed to narrow to the sound of her own ragged, shallow breath. It ended as swiftly as it began. He pulled back only marginally, his face still close, his amber eyes intense and searching over the top of her mask. "That is the final seal, Julia." His voice was thick, low, strained. "No longer an alliance. It is a vow. A vow. A promise of a life that would be defined by shadows, secrets, and an unbearable, profound connection." The taste of the kiss lingered, the faint, clean taste of mint and the metallic tang of cold night air. He stepped back, a single, decisive pace, breaking the overwhelming physical proximity. "You are no longer unmarriageable. You are mine. Now go inside. I will see to the consequences." He did not wait for her reply. He melted back into the deep shadow of the archway, his black cloak becoming one with the night. Julia stood utterly motionless, her hand rising, trembling slightly again to touch her lips. The velvet of her gown, the mask, the entire ballroom, all of it felt suddenly insignificant. The only reality was the cold marble beneath her fingertips and the powerful, clean sensation of his vow lingering on her mouth. She had finally surrendered the weight of her loneliness, only to take on the terrifying, exhilarating burden of his devotion. The intensity of the masked ball and the swift, absolute finality of the kiss threw Julia into a state of profound, terrifying clarity. She walked through the next few days in a daze, the world appearing strangely two-dimensional. The Bordeaux velvet, which still hung in her closet, felt like a dangerous artifact from a separate life. She chose, again, the defensive shade, the elegant, deep emerald silk, for a required morning call at the formidable Lady Danvers' residence. The color was one of public sophistication, demanding respect, concealing the internal chaos. She needed the strength today, because she knew instinctively that the consequence of Simon's kiss would soon manifest. She found him not in the main saloon, but in the desolate, seldom-used library, a massive room lined with forgotten volumes that smelled of dry paper and old leather. He stood alone, staring out at the weak winter sun struggling through a thin layer of fog. He wore a plain, dark morning coat, and his posture was one of uncharacteristic stillness, a man momentarily unburdened by the necessity of command. "You are avoiding the light, Simon." Julia's voice was soft, barely a sound in the vast silence of the room. He did not startle. He turned slowly, his expression one of deep, concentrated exhaustion. His amber eyes, usually so sharp and challenging, were shadowed. "The light, Julia, is the least of my concerns." He walked towards a large mahogany table, picked up a single heavy volume and set it down with a deliberate, soft thud. "I am avoiding the cost. The cost of our alliance has already been paid. The debt is secured. That was the political cost." He walked toward her, not quickly, but with a heavy, measured pace that spoke of a man carrying an unbearable weight. "I speak of the personal cost." He stopped a few feet away. His hands were clasped behind his back, a deliberate choice to maintain distance, a silent acknowledgement of the power his touch now held. "You are no longer unmarriageable. You are marked. Marked by the sheer, undeniable fact of my continuous, focused attention. You are a vulnerability, my vulnerability." Julia felt a sudden, fierce warmth flood her chest, a dangerous, possessive joy. He sees me not as a burden, but as a risk he is willing to take. The thought was intoxicating. And what of my choice? Perhaps I welcome the mark, Perhaps the mark of the Duke of Ravenswood is infinitely preferable to the brand of unmarriageable society gave me. He finally moved his hands, lifting one slowly and resting his fingertips on the high, severe neckline of her emerald gown. He did not touch her skin, merely the rich, cold silk. The small visual detail, his dark skin against the cool green fabric, was a stark contrast. I felt your tremor when I kissed you, Julia. It was not a tremble of fear. It was a tremor of release, the absolute relief of a woman who finally chooses her own fate. I took that from you. I took your final solitude. That is the cost. You took my lie, Simon. The lie that I was content to be alone. His eyes searched hers, demanding truth, allowing no pretense. He leaned in marginally, a subtle, forbidden breach of their personal space. The faint scent of pipe tobacco and clean linen, a mix of hard work and formality, was suddenly overwhelming. You must understand the gravity of my devotion, Julia. I have protected you from the debt. I will protect you from the society that despises you. But if a man like me claims you, even in secret, the shadow of my rivals falls upon your head. Then let me stand in the shadow. I am tired of the sunlight. The intensity of his gaze softened, just a fraction. It was the deepest level of tenderness he had ever allowed her to see. I need you to know that there is no retreating from this, Julia. My claim is absolute. It will not be defined by polite calls and dancing. It will be defined by danger, by what is necessary. She felt her eyelids prickle with a sudden, unexpected sting. It was not a prelude to tears, but a physical manifestation of the overwhelming emotional truth of his words. She reached out, an instinctive, reckless movement, and placed her hand over his, pressing the fine silk of her gown against his fingers. It was the second touch, firmer, more deliberate than the first. If you are a shield, Simon, then I am the steel beneath it. Use me. I trust your judgment and I accept the risk. The admission was a complete, final surrender of her will. She saw a flicker of relief, profound and unexpected, pass over his stern features. He gripped her hand briefly, a firm, possessive squeeze against the silk before pulling away, breaking the circuit of their connection. There will be no more secret kisses, Julia. Not until this situation is irrevocably resolved, until the danger is removed. You must be untouchable. The command was absolute, a powerful assertion of his control, but it was also the ultimate act of protection. He turned back to the window, the fog outside seeming to press in on the glass. We need to leave London, now. The final move must be made on my estate, where the influence of my rivals is minimal. Be ready by morning. Wear the pale blue. It is the color of innocence. We need that deception now. The silence that followed was heavy with the tension of their impending departure. Julia stood alone, staring at the dark, powerful expanse of his back, the heavy metallic smell of old books, and his proximity now her only comfort. She had paid the cost, her solitude. And in return, she had gained the exhilarating, terrifying burden of his absolute devotion. The following morning was chaotic, a blur of hushed urgency and cold anxiety. Julia followed Simon's instructions meticulously. She dressed in the soft, defensive, pale blue silk, the color of deliberate fragility, its thin fabric a poor defense against the chill of the morning air. A small, serviceable trunk was packed with only essentials. The plan was simple. A swift, inconspicuous departure under the guise of an early Christmas visit to a distant relative. However, the universe, and the unrelenting scrutiny of the ton, had other plans. As Julia was about to slip out the side entrance of her family's townhouse, a messenger arrived with a letter, sealed with the intimidating crest of a powerful earl, a man known to be Simon's most formidable rival. The letter was not addressed to her. It was a thinly veiled threat to her family, a direct consequence of the alliance they had just forged in secret. The tone was polite, but the message was brutal. Simon's rivals knew they had found his vulnerability. Julia's hands, clutching the letter, began to shake violently, the crisp paper rustling like dry leaves. She felt a sickening, dizzying drop in her stomach. The color pale blue suddenly felt like a blatant lie, a target painted on her back. They know. They are using my family to hurt him. The fear was cold and sharp. She ran back upstairs, discarding the defensive pale blue. If she was to be a target, she would be a fortress. She pulled out the gown of Uva Bordeaux velvet, the color of dangerous confession, of strength, and of the unspoken vow she had made on the balcony. Downstairs, Simon was waiting by the closed carriage door, his expression like granite. He wore the heavy, severe riding cloak from the garden, his hands encased in dark leather gloves. He looked less like a duke and more like a high commander preparing for battle. He saw the dress immediately. His eyes, in the poor morning light, went molten. "You were instructed to wear the light blue, Julia." "The light blue is a lie, Simon." She walked towards him, her footsteps decisive on the polished floor. "They know. I received this." She handed him the letter. He broke the seal with a quick, hard snap of his wrist. His eyes scanned the contents, and the muscles in his jaw tightened, the only outward sign of a massive internal struggle. He crumpled the paper in his gloved hand, a small, violent gesture. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket of unspoken danger. "They are fast, faster than I anticipated." His voice was low, rough with self-reproach. "This is my fault. I have put you in the direct line of fire." "No. You gave me a choice, and I chose my vulnerability." She stood before him, the velvet of the Bordeaux dress a defiant shield. "If I am to be your target, I will not be a faint pastel. I will be visible." He reached out, his gloved hand hovering over her face. He did not touch her, but the proximity was intense, a boundary severely tested. "You are a fire, Julia." His voice was thick with emotion, a rare crack in his formidable control. "And I will not allow them to extinguish you." The plan changes. He looked around the empty, silent hall, his gaze sharp, assessing every shadow. "We cannot wait for the cover of night. We leave now. We take the smaller route. It will be faster, but more exposed." He opened the carriage door with a decisive motion. She saw two armed, grim-faced outriders already mounted, their silhouettes dark against the pale morning light. This was not a social call. This was an evacuation. He offered her his arm, a final, necessary formality. As she placed her hand upon his forearm, she felt the hard, cold muscle beneath the wool of his coat, a source of unyielding strength. "Trust me. Every moment, every decision will be for your protection." "I have already ceded my trust, Simon," she replied, her gaze firm, meeting his without flinching. He helped her into the carriage. As he followed her in, the sudden, overwhelming proximity in the confined space was immense. The carriage door shut with a heavy, resonant thud. The air inside was immediately thick with the scent of fine wool, leather, and the unique, clean scent of him, now mixed with a sharper, metallic note of urgency and danger. The carriage lurched violently forward, its wheels grinding against the gravel. Julia did not look out the window. She looked at Simon. He was sitting opposite her, his knees almost touching hers, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery, but his mind clearly elsewhere, plotting. He was the most beautiful, most terrifying sight she had ever known. This is it, the end of the life I knew, the beginning of a journey with a man whose devotion is my greatest shield and my greatest peril. The Bordeaux dress is no longer a costume. It is a promise. She reached down, her gloved hand resting on the dark velvet of her own skirt. She did not need to speak. She knew, and he knew, that in choosing the color of fire and confession, she had confirmed the vow he had placed upon her lips. The silence of the closed carriage, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of the wheels, was the sound of destiny in motion. The small dark route to the Duke's northern estate proved treacherous. A sudden, violent snowstorm descended, transforming the landscape into a blinding white chaos and forcing their carriage to seek immediate shelter. The outriders located an ancient, disused hunting cabin deep within the Duke's vast, unpopulated woods. The transition from the moving carriage to the cold, stark confines of the cabin was a flurry of urgent movements and muffled commands. The cabin was primitive, a single room, a stone hearth, and a rough wooden bed covered with heavy, scratchy wool blankets. Julia stood near the newly lit fire, her Bordeaux velvet dress now dusted with snow, the rich, defiant color seeming wildly out of place in the desolate room. The fire cast long, flickering shadows that danced on the rough-hewn walls, making the small space feel both intimate and menacing. Simon dismissed the outriders to the small separate lean-to outside, needing the absolute assurance of their presence, but the privacy of their absence. He turned back to Julia, his dark cloak dripping melting snow onto the cold stone floor. "It is safer here than in the carriage. They will not anticipate this detour." His voice was flat, focused on the logistics of survival. "The cold is penetrating." Julia hugged her arms, feeling the persistent tremor beneath the heavy velvet. She felt cold to her core, but the cold was mixed with the heat of his unwavering attention. Simon did not reply with words. He walked to the hearth, picked up a thick wool blanket and approached her. He placed the heavy blanket around her shoulders, his movements precise and impersonal, yet utterly commanding. The scratchy wool of the blanket provided a rough, immediate warmth, and the brief accidental touch of his fingers against the back of her neck sent a clean, sharp current of awareness through her. The blanket was less a covering and more a protective cage. "You must keep warm. Your health is not a variable I am willing to risk. And yours, Simon? You are soaked." He ignored her, his eyes assessing the room. He walked to the single, small window, his back to her, and watched the unrelenting downpour of snow. The snow is a shield. It buys us time. He turned back to her, the firelight catching the formidable planes of his face. "The door is bolted. We are utterly alone." The statement hung in the air, the acknowledgement of the absolute, compromising intimacy of their situation. There was no terror in the isolation, only a fierce, terrifying calm. This is the consequence, the complete, total surrender to fate. He is my protector, my jailer, and the source of this profound, terrible joy. The silence of the cabin, broken only by the crackle of the damp wood on the fire, felt vast and final. Julia walked slowly toward the fire, her back to the wall, letting the intense heat soak into the thick velvet. Simon remained near the window, a sentinel, a fixed point in the chaos. "Do you regret this alliance, Simon, now that you see the depth of the danger?" He stood there for a long moment, the firelight illuminating the fine dust of melting snow on his dark coat. "I regret nothing I choose. I chose you, Julia. That is the only fact that remains." He pushed off the wall and walked to the rough wooden table. He placed a pistol there, its dark metal stark against the pale wood. The sight of the weapon was a blunt, non-verbal affirmation of the danger outside. He walked to the hearth, his large hands reaching for a piece of wood. He crouched, his muscles flexing beneath the damp coat, tending to the fire with a careful, focused attention. Julia watched him, seeing not the Duke of Ravenswood, but simply Simon. A man focused on survival, on duty, and on the unyielding commitment he had made. "I should have worn the pale blue," she whispered, looking down at the defiant red of her skirt. He did not look up, but his voice was low, rough, and absolute. "Do not insult me with a lie, Julia. The Bordeaux is a better shield than the blue. It tells me what I need to know, that you are not running from me. You are running with me." He stood up, the action bringing him very close to her. He was now fully facing her, the fire blazing between them, casting a warm, enveloping light. He still did not touch her, yet the space between them was charged, electric. "We will share this space. I will take the chair by the door. You will take the bed. You will not fear me. I am your shield." "I do not fear you, Simon. I fear the silence," she confessed, her voice barely audible. His eyes narrowed, their amber deepening in the firelight. He understood. He understood the profound aching silence that was pregnant with all the things they could not say, and the absolute intimacy they could not allow. He moved again, a small, deliberate movement. His hand reached out, not for her, but for a stray strand of her hair that had escaped the severe pin of her style. His fingertips gently pushed the strand back behind her ear. It was the tenderest, most intimate gesture he had ever made. A small protective touch that acknowledged the fear, the cold, and the unyielding bond between them. "I will keep the fire," he said, his voice husky. "There will be no silence, Julia. Not tonight." He walked to the rough chair by the door, took a heavy blanket and sat, assuming his post as sentinel. The pistol lay on the table within easy reach. The fire crackled, the only constant sound. Julia walked to the wooden bed, lay down, and pulled the scratchy blanket up to her chin. She did not close her eyes. She watched his silhouette against the dark, snow-streaked window. She felt the heavy, unyielding warmth of his presence. The cold outside was absolute. The safety inside was absolute. And in the forced intimacy of the small, fire-lit cabin, Julia knew that the final, irrevocable step into their shared life was not the kiss, but this silent, simple act of trust. He was her only light in the absolute darkness. The journey from the cabin, though rushed and fraught with silent danger, culminated in their arrival at Simon's magnificent northern estate, Ravenswood Hall. The manor was a study in formidable ancient wealth, its stone architecture massive and unyielding against the relentless winter landscape. The crisis of the rival earl's threat had forced Simon's hand. He had, with ruthless efficiency, invited a small exclusive circle of guests to Ravenswood for the Christmas period, a desperate attempt to normalize Julia's presence and quash the most damaging whispers with a show of social force. It was Christmas Eve. Julia stood on the edge of the great hall, which was ablaze with 1,000 candles, fragrant with pine and holly. The atmosphere was one of forced, shimmering elegance, a delicate veneer over a cauldron of suspicion and judgment. She wore the Uva Bordeaux velvet once more, a deliberate choice. It was her armor of finality, the color of the vow they had made. She stood a little straighter, her spine unyielding. She no longer cared if the color confessed her passion. She wanted her enemies to see it as a declaration of war. Simon stood near the immense stone fireplace, a focal point of power. He was impeccable in black velvet evening attire, his presence formidable. He did not leave her side for more than a few minutes at a time, a visible, tangible claim that left no room for interpretation. The society around them was now divided into two factions, those who sought to ignore Julia and those who sought to destroy her. The latter faction was led by Lady Ashworth, a woman whose malice was as sharp as her diamond necklace. The moment came during the traditional handing out of the Christmas favors. Lady Ashworth approached Julia, her smile brittle, her eyes glittering with cold calculation. "Miss Julia, such a bold color for an occasion of such innocence. One wonders what sort of declaration you are making with such a choice." The exchange immediately drew the attention of the surrounding guests. The music seemed to recede. The chatter died down. The tension was acute. "I am making no declaration, Lady Ashworth," Julia replied, her voice low and steady. "I merely find the color a better reflection of the strength required to endure a season." "Endure?" Lady Ashworth laughed, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Or conquer? Rumor has it, Miss Julia, that your sudden attachment to the Duke is merely a conquest of necessity, that your unmarriageable status has forced you to trade propriety for protection." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the public execution Julia had spent her entire life dreading. She felt the sudden, alarming flush of heat rise in her neck, a sign of the deep humiliation she could not control. It is true. It is all true. They see the calculation. They see the lack of dowry. They see the raw, desperate bargain. The knowledge was a crushing weight. Before she could speak, Simon was there. He moved with swift, silent purpose, placing himself so close to Julia that the sheer heat of his body was a physical shield against the cold malice of the room. He did not speak to Lady Ashworth. He spoke only to Julia. He reached out, his hand raising slowly, and placed his fingers gently on her shoulder, resting them against the soft pile of the Bordeaux velvet. The touch was possessive, protective, and devastatingly public. "Julia." His voice was a low, steady rumble, carrying an undeniable weight of authority. "Do you find this room excessively warm?" The question was a direct order. "Disregard her. Speak only to me. Retreat into the protection of our bond." Julia looked up at him. His eyes, amber and fiercely protective, were fixed solely on her, ignoring the crowd, ignoring the gossip, ignoring the danger. He was offering her absolute refuge in that single, intense gaze. "It is warm, Simon," she replied, her voice now steady, her humiliation receding beneath the fierce pride his defense ignited. "The fire is very bright tonight." Simon finally glanced at Lady Ashworth, a single, cold, dismissive look that instantly crushed her confidence. Lady Ashworth, Miss Julia is not required to conquer anything in my house. Her presence here is by my choice, and her character is known to me. I suggest you turn your attention to your son's unfortunate debt at the tables." The sharp, brutal dismissal sent a visible shudder through the crowd. Simon had used his full power, not to defend her virtue, but to obliterate her attacker. He kept his hand on her shoulder, a constant grounding weight. He guided her away from the center of the hall toward the smaller, quieter recess near the Christmas tree. "Breathe, Julia," he whispered, his lips near her ear. The scent of pine and the faint, familiar scent of leather was an intoxicating, absolute comfort. They have done their worst, and they have failed. She looked up at the immense, towering Christmas tree, which glittered with hundreds of candles and delicate, paper-thin ornaments. They were right about the bargain, Simon. No, they were wrong about the heart. He stepped fully in front of her, his body a complete, unyielding barrier between her and the room. He lowered his head, his gaze intensely direct. "Tomorrow is Christmas Day. I will end this pretense. I will end the silence. You will be free of the whispers." She knew what he meant. The end of the silence meant the final, irrevocable commitment, the ultimate risk. She reached up, her hand, still trembling slightly, touching the cool, firm line of his jaw. "I am ready, Simon. I have been ready since the cabin." He closed his eyes briefly, a sign of profound, momentary relief, a small surrender of his own iron control. He leaned his forehead against hers for a brief, electric second, a touch that was a world of absolute, profound devotion. Christmas morning arrived at Ravenswood Hall, under a blanket of pristine, silent snow. The atmosphere was deceptively quiet, a stillness that preceded a seismic event. The guests assembled in the main dining room for a traditional Christmas breakfast, the air thick with the unspoken tension of the previous night's confrontation. Julia chose the most gentle, most vulnerable of her gowns, the pale blue satin. It was a choice not of innocence, but of absolute faith. She had worn the Bordeaux for the fight. She would wear the blue for the surrender of her heart. She sat at the vast, polished mahogany table, her composure perfect, but her heart a nervous, rhythmic drum against her ribs. Simon sat at the head of the table, formidable and unyielding. The silence, punctuated only by the clinking of silver against china, was suffocating. After the meal, Simon rose, his movement commanding immediate, total silence. He did not ask for attention, he simply took it. He stood by the fireplace, his gaze sweeping the assembled guests, rivals, gossips, and a few true friends, before settling, finally, exclusively, on Julia. "I thank you all for honoring my invitation to Ravenswood." His voice was a low, resonant baritone that carried easily through the room. "I had intended this gathering to be an ordinary social obligation. However, circumstances and certain recent greetings in this very room have forced me to bring clarity to an arrangement that has been, until now, deliberately veiled." He paused. The silence was immense, the only sound, the faint, dry crackle of the fire. Every single eye in the room was fixed on the Duke. "You know, all of you, the social standing of Miss Julia. You have been swift to define her by what she lacks: a grand dowry, a flawless lineage, the easy charm of the effortlessly desirable. You have called her behind her back and to her face unmarriageable." Julia felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold and numb. She instinctively gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white against the dark wood. She wanted to disappear, but his gaze held her captive. "And I wish to state that you are all unequivocally correct." A murmur of shock rippled through the guests. Julia's breath hitched, a gasp of pure shock and betrayal. Her own vision blurred, the festive lights turning into shimmering points of agonizing light. Simon did not look away from her. He looked only at the raw, vulnerable fear in her eyes, and his voice deepened, taking on a powerful, absolute authority. "She is unmarriageable to you, because you measure worth by gold and by the fragile vanity of your approval. But I measure worth by steel, by conviction, and by the courage to stand alone against the malice of this world." He took a slow, deliberate step away from the fireplace, closing the distance between his position of power and the seat where Julia sat. Miss Julia is not here as a guest. She is not here as an obligation. She is here as the absolute center of a devotion that you cannot comprehend, because it is not based on calculation. It is based on truth. He reached her. He stood directly beside her, his hand resting on the back of her chair, a protective, undeniable boundary. I do not choose her because I need her fortune. I do not choose her to escape social obligation. I choose her because she is the single, unyielding thing in a world of pleasant lies, because she saw past the title and the wealth, and saw the man who needed an equal, not a possession. He turned his body fully toward the room, his voice rising, a powerful declaration that crushed the remaining silence. I stand before you on Christmas Day, and declare that the price of my alliance is the end of this hypocrisy. I have secured her from her brother's debt, and now I secure her for myself. He reached out, his hand finally reaching hers. Her hand, small and pale against the dark blue velvet of her sleeve, was swallowed entirely by the firm, encompassing warmth of his glove. I do not offer her my hand out of duty. I offer her my life. I offer her my devotion. I offer her the absolute promise that she will never stand alone again. The shadow of my rivalry falls upon her. Good. Then let my light be the only thing she sees. He pulled her to her feet, a smooth, commanding motion. Julia rose, her heart pounding with a fierce, terrifying exhilaration. The pale blue a stark contrast to the black intensity of his suit. He looked down at her, his amber eyes shining with a profound, terrifying tenderness. It was not a request. It was the final, absolute surrender. Julia, I love your mind, your pride, and the honesty that makes you unmarriageable to them. Will you accept the devotion of the Duke of Ravenswood and become my Duchess? Julia did not speak. She did not need to. Her eyes, shining with an absolute pure light, gave him the only answer he needed. She squeezed his hand, the final, total show, don't tell of her devotion. Simon looked out at the silent, stunned room, his grip on Julia's hand absolute. You have your answer. The whispers end now. The Duke has spoken. He did not wait for a single reaction. He gently turned Julia, tucked her arm securely in his, and led her out of the dining room. They walked away from the stunned silence, away from the judgment, toward the quiet intimacy of the hall. The final sound was the heavy, resonant thud of the oak door closing behind them, sealing them into their new, shared, dangerous destiny.